So we are going to talk about genetics. Genetics can be bad. This is like a widely held view that things like women have trouble getting tenure in math, or women quit jobs after having children, or women are submissive. These genetics seems to convey the idea that there is something in the nature of women that made them that way. And this essentialist thinking is connected to things like stereotyping, prejudice, endorsement of status quo, and these things are bad. So what can we do with genetics, knowing that they are connected to essentialist thinking and therefore with things like oppression and prejudice and stereotype? So what we want to do today is to review 3 strategies for what to do with genetics in a language that is improved. Then we will go briefly over limitations of those strategies, and we will propose a 4th option, the Reexplanation in structural terms of social genetics. This is not new. This proposal has already been proposed by one of us in previous empirical work. But what we're going to do today that is somehow new is to propose this re-explanation of genetics in structural terms as a way of counterspeech, or as a form of counterspeech. So what should we do with social genetics, given that they are connected to bad things, in particular essentialist thinking? So one thing that has been proposed is to avoid genetics, to eliminate social genetics in particular from our language. For example, Langer in 2011 proposes not to use racial and gender genetics, even when they are true, because they suggest, like they seem to convey this essentialist interpretation. A different strategy is to replace genetics, or we can say also ameliorate genetics, right? When different terms or expressions are problematic, one way to face them is just to do something with them, like to change them. So some researchers have proposed to replace genetic statements for quantified statements. For example, we see that in the work of Langton, Langer, and Anderson in 2012. Another strategy is to just keep some of the social genetics, and forget about others. So this, for example, has been proposed by Ritchie in 2011, who says that actually social genetics are our best tool to capture the systematicity of structural oppression. And this is something that, for example, quantified statements cannot do. So moving on to the limitations of these 3 strategies, one problem with elimination, the first strategy of social genetics, is that, like all linguistic interventions that involve some drastic change, it's going to be difficult. It risks unfeasibility. So in particular, if genetic language is connected to primitive cognitive mechanisms for generalization and categorization, and this has been proposed by, for example, Leslie, a ban on genetics would mean going against deeply ingrained psychological tendencies to seek generalizable regularities and to communicate about them efficiently. So elimination of social genetics seems to be pretty difficult. It's going to face a lot of obstacles. So one limitation that we see with the second strategy, replacement or amelioration, is that it seems that it faces similar difficulties than elimination. So, for example, non-genetic quantified statements are often remembered as genetics and interpreted like genetics. And this suggests, again, as argued by Leslie and Gelman in 2012, that genetics express cognitively default generalizations. So attempts to turning them into quantified statements mean fighting against that fighting against that default cognitive mechanism. And finally, a limitation that we see with the last strategy, selection, like keeping just a few of those social genetics and disregarding others, is that it does not inform us of what makes some genetics problematic and some others, good to keep. I'm not going to go into details about that unless someone wants to do that during the questions. So the fourth option, that again was already introduced in recent empirical work done on structural thinking and the structural construal of genetics by Vasileva, Vasil et al. 2018, and Vasileva, Vasil and Lombroso 2020, is that we can keep social genetics in an improved language with a twist, with an explanation. So what we need to pay attention is the explanation that is presupposed or provided or invited when the social genetic is uttered. So contra the dominant view, this empirical work reveals that genetics do not necessarily convey essentialist beliefs. So in a series of studies, Vasil, Vasileva, and Lombroso found that when presented with genetic statements on novel fictional groups, adults can adopt either a structural or an internalist, essentialist interpretation with minimal cueing. So the key here is the explanation that accompanies the genetic. The explanation presents the connection between the given category and the property as either the result of stable external constraints or due to internal factors. So there are at least these two ways we can represent stable associations between properties and category membership. So one way is the internalist construal that is paying attention to women as a category. So, for example, things like quit jobs after having children or work as nurses, not math professors. So these properties are attached to the category women. The different construal, that is the structural construal, sees the properties as attached to the social position that this social group occupies. So it's not women as a category that quit jobs after having children, but people who occupy that social position. So the key difference here is where you attach the properties of social groups, either to the category occupying the position or to the position. And it's the explanation that accompanies the genetic that can make the difference. So we can see someone saying something like women have trouble getting tenure in math, or women quit jobs after having children, referring to the position, referring to the category and essentializing that category, or we can see the same statements said referring to the social position. So, we see that there are then multiple construals of a single genetic. And in the first one, I'm getting too excited, but then out of excitement, I'm not being clear. So the explanation, again, that could make the difference between going for the internalist construal or the structural construal would be something like, for example, if someone says women have trouble getting tenure in math, and then says, well, this is due to women's nature, their lack of capacity or their motivation, then that is conveying clearly an essentialist interpretation. But if someone accompanies such a genetic, women have trouble getting tenure in math, with a different explanation, like this is the case by virtue of women's position in our society, by different external stable constraints, this explanation makes the difference and will convey a completely different interpretation. So again, the idea, given what these empirical results suggest, is that genetics are compatible with two interpretations: internalist, that usually leads to essentializing, and structural. And what determines then the role of social genetics in language is not inside the genetics themselves, but outside of them, in the explanations that are either presupposed or invited or actually provided with the social genetics. So this fourth option of explaining social genetics or re-explaining social genetics, as we like to call it, has advantages in that re-explanations deproblematizes social genetics, and we get to keep social genetics and therefore their advantages, as pointed out by Ricci. Also, the shift to structural genetics doesn't face the psychological challenges for other strategies like turning them into quantified statements, and this is suggested by these empirical studies too. And also another advantage is that we get to have a unified approach for what to do with social genetics. And this seems to be an asset given all the troubles that researchers have when they try to, for example, come up with a unified view about what is the meaning of genetics. So given the variety and pluralism with regard to the meaning of genetics, it seems to me that it's good to have one single unified approach for the pragmatics of genetics. And additionally, Reexplanation of genetics is an intervention that not only cleans up language from problematic linguistic tools, but does something else, is inviting reflection on social factors, on constraints. So now, what is that thing about Reexplanation as counterspeech? So counterspeech is usually directed at toxic speech, right? And toxic speech is usually so in covert ways. It often presupposes, rather than explicitly says, toxic content. So in particular, blocking as a form of counter-speech is a way of resisting what is behind or inside a speaker's words. For example, their presuppositions. And it aims at preventing the accommodation of such content in the conversational score. So blocking toxic speech is a way of undoing what such speech is doing to the conversation. So what could counter-speech look like in the case of social genetics? So again, we definitely can find two very extreme ways of using these two social genetics in the examples. And we can even find a wider variety of speakers. So we might have someone saying women have trouble getting tenure in math, or women are submissive, and they might have in mind different things. For example, think about the committed sexes. Someone who would say something like women are submissive while believing that women are essentially submissive, right? And while having the intention to convey exactly that belief. Then we can have the committed activist, who utters women are submissive, intending to convey that the social position women occupy place them in submissive positions. Then we have someone who we call the tiptoeing sexes. So imagine someone saying women are submissive with the intention to convey an essentialist interpretation, but without strictly committing to such a belief, maybe because they just want to leave room for denial. We can think of at least another case who we call the casual speaker, who utters women are submissive without necessarily endorsing essentialist beliefs, nor intending to convey an essentialist interpretation. They're just describing statistical regularities. So what do we do with this variety of speakers when we think about how to counteract social genetics? Well, we might try to guess which kind of speaker we are facing, but we might also forget about that, about guessing the intentions and the beliefs of the speaker. And we might instead focus on what such utterances of social genetics do to the conversation, independently of what speakers intend and believe. So in the sense of what is what they are adding to the conversational score when something like that is being said. So what gets to be accommodated in the conversational score can do things outside of the conversation. For example, it can impact observers and it can do a lot of stuff in the conversation. So unless it is obvious that the interpretation is not problematic, for example, when we are in an activist meeting and we are all sharing this common ground of what we are referring to the social position women occupy when we say things like women are submissive or women have trouble getting tenure. So what we propose, let's re-explain unless it's obvious that the interpretation is not problematic. So independently of speakers' intentions and beliefs, re-explanation helps keep the conversational score away from an essentialist interpretation. And that's it. Thank you very much, and we'll be happy to hear your to learn from your questions and comments.